Background.
Namaste and greetings. I, Aswash Mahanta, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to all of you to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. Today, we are gathered here for the final day of the online International Winter School Program 2023, a 3-day immersive online certificate training course on feminism, fundamentals, facets, and future. This training program is organized by IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, GISC, New Delhi. I welcome you all to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for putting your time, energy, and efforts to truly understand the issues concerning the very fundamentals and the various facets of feminism, thus helping us bring together the practitioners, scholars, and participants for impactful policy research and action. This session will be chaired by Professor VIBHUTI Patel,
Hello.
visiting distinguished professor at IMPRI. Our convener is Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI. This 3 days program has an excellent panel that includes Dr. Leena Pujari, Professor Roxana Marinescu, Professor Manisha Desai, Dr. Vahida Nainar, Professor Vibhuti Patel, Professor Soumya Uma, Professor Linda Lane, and Professor Vijay Lakshmi Nanda. Before we start today's session, I would once again like to announce the housekeeping rules for everyone. Please join the meeting on time. There will be a question and answer session after each presentation. Share your questions on the Q&A box and not on the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise. Refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite our chairperson, Professor Vibhuti Patel, to start off the session with her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Good evening, friends. Dr. Arjun Kumar, Dr. Simi Mehta, Satyam, Ashwath Mahanta, IMPRI team, and today's resource person, Professor Soumya Uma, Professor Linda Lane, and Professor Vijay Lakshmi Nanda. And I think my earlier resource persons are also here. So I greet them all, Dr. Leena Pujari, Professor Roxana Marinescu. And I would like to just summarize the thing in 2 minutes, that in the last day of this online International Winter School Program, we are happy with extremely active involvement of participants in this whole course. And from previous 5 lectures that dealt with feminism, a genesis and trajectory of feminisms, aspects of contemporary feminisms with a focus on European trends, feminist reflexivity and decolonial, postcolonial and intersectional feminism, feminism and sexual violence law reforms, and fundamentals of feminist theory and praxis in India. Now, what are the learnings of these 5 lectures? That feminist theory is not only about women, it is about world, engaged through critical intersectional perspective, despite many significant differences among liberal, socialist, radical, postmodern, psychoanalytical, ecofeminist, black feminist, postcolonial feminist, womanist. Most feminist theory challenge double standards for boys and girls, men and women, and they also challenge the androcentric worldview. And they also talk about going beyond the gender binary and accepting gender fluidity. A feminist view generally oriented towards fluid processes of emergence rather than static entities in one-way relationships. They are committed to being a political as well as intellectual enterprise. It is rooted in and it is responsible to the movements of equality, freedom, justice for all. And 3 important contemporary questions within the feminist theory concern One is the subjectivity, narrative, and materiality that came in all the presentations, right from the first one, which talked about the genesis of feminism. Global neoliberal geopolitics, about which Dr. Roxana spoke in great detail, but I think in all other presentations also, that was a major concern. And global ecologies, the climate justice and ecofeminist concerns that also are extremely important. Feminist theories are rooted in intersectionality, interdisciplinarity, and interlinkages between scholarship and activism. So theory and praxis, they are very important. They are intertwined in feminist worldview. Feminism is grounded in lived experiences and plurality of ideological positions. It is not my way or highway. We all may have differences, but there is a democratic space and inclusivity in feminist discourses. Wherever may be their locations, or primary responsibility of feminists is to contribute to positive social change based on foundation of mutual respect, gender inclusivity, and transcending gender binary. So now, today, there are three very important presentations in this concluding day, which is Feminisms and the Law, by some reflections on intersections by Professor Soumya Uma, Feminism and Intersectionality by Professor Linda Lane, and Professor Vijayalakshmi Nanda's work on feminism and discourse on rights in India. So with this brief background, I request now to Professor Soumya Uma to take over. And
thank you, ma'am. Again, our first speaker for today's session is Professor Dr. Soumya Uma. Professor Uma is Professor, Jindal Global Law School and Director of the Center for Women's Rights at JGLS. Ma'am will be talking on feminisms and the law, some reflections on the intersections. Over to you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Professor VIBHUTI Patel, and thank you to the IMPRI team for inviting me for this. I was there for some of the sessions and the discussion yesterday, and I realized that the participants were really active. So I'm very happy to be here today and to be able to have a conversation. So the topic that I will be speaking on is law and feminisms, some reflections on the intersectionality. So since my professional background is in law, what I plan to do in this presentation is primarily to try and look at law through a feminist lens, and also to basically what are the feminist principles, how do we use these feminist principles to examine law, to analyze law, and to understand its ramifications for women. So this is what I'm going to try to do through my presentation. There may be some overlaps with the earlier sessions. I hope that the participants will take it as some kind of running over the concepts again and so on. Particularly Professor Dr. Wahida Nainar's session yesterday spoke very specifically on the law reform process related to sexual violence in India. What I will be touching upon that, but mine is more general in terms of law, and I will be providing examples from the Indian laws and Indian legal context. So to get back to what we understand by feminism, So feminism is a movement. Um, Feminism is a movement towards equal society for all persons without discrimination or exploitation. When we say it is a movement, Bell Hooks had said that it's a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. One of the common grounds when we think that, this is something that is for all persons across the whole world. So then, what is the common ground? What is the common experience, particularly for women across the world, across the geopolitical context? The common ground then is patriarchy and the experience of patriarchy, which many women or most women go through. Patriarchy also impacts all other genders, not only women, but particularly in terms of women. The common ground then is to recognize, address, subvert patriarchy and eliminate it altogether. That is one of the major goals. And when we say patriarchy, we are talking about a systematic subordination of women and other marginalized communities through male superiority, control, domination, exploitation, and oppression. So when we say feminist theory, what the feminist theory actually interrogates is the inequalities between the sexes along intersectional lines, and it also seeks to effect change in areas where these intersectionalities create power inequality. So power differentials are something that are very, very important in understanding. One of the things that I'm often asked, and I'm sure many of you are also often asked, is who is a feminist? Can anyone be a feminist, or is it only women who can be feminists? So one of the very simple explanations of this was given by Kamla Bhasin in her book on patriarchy. And she says that anyone who recognizes the existence of sexism, gender-based discrimination, male domination, and patriarchy, and takes some action against it is a feminist. So that action could be action in terms of writing about it. It could be action in terms of helping women at the ground level. It could be action in terms of filing a petition in a court of law. So it could be any kind of action, not particularly limited to social or political or legal action. So persons of all genders can be feminists, including men, and women can be patriarchal too. And these are two very important points that we must remember, because very often when we see, particularly in my area of law, there are times when we come across a judgment written by a woman judge. And the question that many people ask is, being a woman judge, how can she write this judgment which goes against women, or which shows a gender bias against women? So just because a person is a woman, we cannot assume that they are a feminist, because there are internalized patriarchies among women as well. So why speak of feminism in the plural? Because if you look at the title of my talk today, I'm mentioning the term feminisms and not feminism. And the reason is that there is no one single person or theory, and there is no specific abstract or fixed definition of feminism for all times to come. And feminism is based on historical and culturally concrete realities and levels of perceptions, consciousness, and actions. But this understanding of feminism based on the societal context, as society changes, the perceptions within feminism also change, which is why it is not really fixed. And this was a point which Professor VIBHUTI Patel in her introductory words also pointed to. Just as water takes the shape of a container, feminism can be articulated in different ways based on local situations and issues and at different points in time. So, for example, we speak about Gandhian feminism in India because the Gandhian philosophy is very, very strongly embedded into our history, into our culture, and into our nationalist discourse and all of that. But Gandhian feminism is not something that is as popular or as well known in other countries. So this shows how depending on the local situations and issues at different points in time, feminism is also articulated differently. Even within the same country or place at the same period in time, feminists differ in idea of historical roots of patriarchy and the final resolution for a non-exploitative society that is free of class, caste, race, gender bias, and so on. And it is because of these differences that you have various schools of feminism that have come in. Now, I want to take us through forms of women's subordination, and I will give small examples of each of these, and then we will look at how law plays a role with regard to each of these aspects of women's subordination. So the first form of women's subordination is devaluation. That means reducing or dismissing the value of women. And when I say women here, I also mean girls. So one of the ways in which this happens is by son preference. Another way that it happens is through the unpaid housework and the care work that a woman gives. When it is a man who is earning outside, who is working outside the house, he is earning a certain amount of money. There's a financial value that is ascribed to his labor. But the work that the woman does inside the home, whether it is cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, taking care of elderly, all of that, all those things, the care work that a woman does, there is no real financial value to it. And in fact, in recent times, even in India, there has been a discourse around this. Next, we look at discrimination. So discrimination is also a kind of women's subordination, both in private and public spheres. One way of discrimination which happened, which continues to happen, in fact, is the wage differentials between the labor of a man and a labor of a woman. If you go, for example, to construction sites, if you go, even to agricultural labor or many other sites, you find that the women are paid half of what the man is paid, sometimes 1/3 even. And then the justification for that is that the men are doing hard labor, whereas the women are not doing that harder labor. So, this is one way in which a discrimination happens, which is very, very direct kind of a discrimination. But there are indirect discrimination also that happens. That is, indirect discrimination is a manner in which the conditions of work are such that it becomes difficult for a woman to actually take part on equal terms with the man. So that will be an example of an indirect discrimination. Disregard. Disregard is a very, very important form of women's subordination. Disregard of her choices, of her decisions, of her aspirations. So one example of disregard, and this is at the top of my mind because I'm writing on this aspect, which is the honor crimes. So where women's choice in terms of their intimate partner, that choice is not respected, and it is disregarded by her family, by her caste, by her community, and they think that they can decide on her behalf, and her decisions and her choices should not be respected. So that is one example. The fourth form of women's subordination is control, and control over finances, sexuality, mobility, reproduction. So control over queer women and their sexuality is one such example. The fifth form of women's subordination is exploitation. So prostitution, trafficking, pornography, these are examples of this form of women's subordination. Humiliation, which is another form where, I'm giving the example of treatment of widow or menstrual exclusion that is done to women during their menstruation every month. So those are forms of humiliation as well. Other forms of humiliation are forced nudity of women and exhibiting their body before in the presence of everyone. That's a form of humiliation as well. Oppression at the individual, institutional, and societal or cultural levels. Violence by family, community, state, and market. Now, the impact of all these forms of women's subordination is silencing and reinforcing patriarchal power. And the impact is also that it destroys self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-respect. How do feminisms have an interconnection with law? So we have had a look at the various forms of subordination. Now, law has been fundamental in the historical subordination of women. One is that most of the lawmakers traditionally have been men, and they have formulated the laws as per their own experiences. And the assumption is that the experiences of the women mirror that of the men who were writing these laws. So what we have embedded in the laws are male standards, and they are reflection of male experiences. The central focus of all feminist theories about the law is first, examining and opposing patriarchy, and second, challenging, subverting, or transforming the relationship between law and society through the lens of women. So in this, when we say there is a need to unmask traditional and often ignored inequalities and disabilities in society, these are inequalities that are supported by law. For example, in criminal law, there are certain kinds of inequalities which are supported by the law as well. When we say law, I'm not talking only about the statutes, but I'm also talking about the judgments which interpret the statutes and give meaning to the statutes. So in criminal law, for example, the manner in which rape is constructed or a rape victim's testimony is looked at, there are inequalities that come in that, and there are male standards that come in that as well. For instance, there was a judgment which said that that was a case in which the woman and the man were colleagues and they had drinks together, and after that the man raped the woman and she fell asleep. She was tired and she fell asleep, and the judge says, how could she fall asleep? The moment she is raped, she should have immediately gone and complained to the police. How is it that she complained about it only the next day morning? And this is very unbecoming of women. So this kind of a male standard. So how women should react when they are raped, while they are being raped, after they are being raped, before they are being raped, how they should behave is something that where the male standards come in, and we see that through judgments. Just another example in terms of male standards is about family law. If we take for instance the grounds of divorce, and one of the grounds is something called mental cruelty. So when a husband is being mentally cruel to the wife, then the wife can ask for a divorce. And if the wife has been mentally cruel to the husband can ask for a divorce. The courts have then tried to interpret from certain acts as to whether it amounts to mental cruelty or not. So as far as women are concerned, one of the grounds on which women are considered to be mentally cruel to their husbands is that they have asked the husband to set up a separate home for themselves rather than stay with his parents. So if the woman tells her husband that let us stay together separately away from your parents, then that is considered to be mental cruelty. Another reason, another ground that is given by the courts is if the woman refuses to have sex with the man without any proper reason. Now, what is proper reason is something that the court will decide. So it could be that that particular day she was just not in the mood. Now, will that be considered a proper reason in the eyes of the court? And what then happens to her bodily autonomy and her sexual autonomy and her bodily integrity is something that comes into question. So these are just examples that I'm giving you of how male standards creep in when there is either a formulation of the law or in its interpretation by the courts of law. So feminist perspectives of the law. Firstly, the feminist perspective is that law is not gender or caste or class neutral. So feminist perspectives of the law actually take on from something called critical legal theory, and the critical legal theory believed that that law is actually a tool for oppression by the dominant classes over the subordinate classes. So that is something that the critical legal theory propounds, and feminist legal theory takes on from that, and it looks at it through the feminist lens. So it looks at the law by applying the principles of feminism, and it says that law reflects patriarchal interests in society. It relegates all others to second-class citizenry. So, for example, legitimacy in marriage, legitimate and illegitimate children. So these are all concepts which have their source in patriarchy. Some of the limitations of the law which the feminist legal theory has highlighted. First limitation is that law preserves status quo as it aims at stability. So, you know, in the law school, in one of the first courses that we go for, we are taught about the functions of law. And one of the main functions of law that we are taught is that the law should be consistent, the law should be stable, it should be certain, it should be clear. And unless it has all these features, people will not be able to understand it and access it and so on. So law aims at stability. And when it aims at stability, it also then preserves the status quo. Now, what happens to those status quo, to that status quo, when there are hierarchies within society? Then law tends to preserve those hierarchies in the interest of stability. Whether we talk about caste hierarchy, class hierarchy, gender hierarchy. So this is one critique from the feminist perspective of the law. This is a critique of the law. Second limitation of the law that the feminist legal theory talks about is that it naturally embodies dominant cultures, attitudes, perceptions, presumptions, expectations, and values, and presents it as universal or as neutral. So we have many examples of this, but the whole discourse around domestic violence is one example. When a woman goes and complains about domestic violence, you know, when she goes to the police, or when she you know, when the case goes before the court, one of the first things is that there is a presumption that she is lying. There is a presumption that she's exaggerating. There is a presumption that perhaps she has been too intolerant, and she should have been patient enough. And this is what happens nowadays, because women have become very educated, so they don't want to adjust in a family. Husband raises his hand and immediately the woman runs to the police station. So this is a kind of dominant culture's attitude and perception, that women are manipulative, women are liars, women are exaggerating, and women are intolerant, and women are basically conniving to use the law against the poor men. So women are then shown to be the perpetrator, and the men who have actually committed domestic violence is shown to be the victim. So this is a kind of dominant culture's perception which actually turns the law on its head. So the women who are meant to be using the law find themselves suddenly that they are accused of being perpetrators. Law stands for justice, and justice for all. That is the ideal. But law has consistently failed to provide justice to those outside the dominant culture. So I gave you an example of domestic violence, but even in the case of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, you know, whenever there are cases I had gone the other day to for a judges training, and the judges told me that we come across so many cases of atrocities under the Atrocities Act, and we know that for a fact that the complainant is lying. Because they are there only to pressurize the other side to try and get some compensation. So this is again a kind of understanding which is of the dominant culture. So the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act was specifically meant for the kind of atrocities which were committed on the Dalits and the Adivasis. And yet in its interpretation, it is a dominant culture a viewpoint through which it is getting interpreted. So I also want to clarify that feminism seek not to construct law and legal institutions to favor women. So the idea is not that, okay, women need to now, so long the laws were all weighed against women, now it needs to be weighed in favor of women. No, that is not what feminists seek, but they want to ensure that they do not disfavor women and other marginalized groups. So this is something that Hilaire Barnett has said. I was talking a little while ago about forms of women's subordination. I have only about 3 to 4 minutes left, I think. But I want to quickly point out, if you look at the font in yellow, those are some, cases and some laws that I want to quickly highlight. So on women's housework, valuing housework, there was a Supreme Court judgment the year before last, on equal work for equal pay, maternity benefits. You have Maternity Benefit Act, you have Equal Remuneration Act. So these are to prevent discrimination. On disregard, you have judgments like Lata Singh versus State of UP, which talks about how for women, for adult women, they have an absolute right to decide whom to marry and whom to have a relationship with, and nobody can disregard their choices. So it's a kind of reiteration of the position that women have the decisional autonomy for it. On humiliation and menstrual exclusion, Sabrimala judgment, which many of you would be aware of. On exploitation, I just want to highlight state laws prohibiting Devdasi system. Since I have very little time, I'm just what do feminists critique about the law? And I think I will perhaps end with this, and then I will open myself to whatever questions. So what is it about law that feminists critique? So firstly, they critique statutes and statutory provisions. For example, you would be aware of this concept of restitution of conjugal rights, which is a matrimonial remedy. It's there in the Hindu Marriage Act, and according to this remedy, between the husband and the wife, if one person deserts the other person can use the court and compel the person who has left them to come back to them. So this is called restitution of conjugal rights. And feminists have for a very long time critiqued this law, saying that even though on the face of it, it looks like there is no discrimination because this is a remedy which husbands and wives have, but in reality, wives, this law impacts the wives in a much more negative manner, because the husband can rape the wife and then she would be compelled to be pregnant with a child that she may not even want. So this is an example of how statutes and statutory provisions may be critiqued. In Indian Penal Code, you would be aware of the adultery provision, which came to be critiqued for a very long time. And then in Joseph Shine versus Union of India a few years ago, that particular provision was struck down as unconstitutional. The second aspect in law that feminists critique are procedural and evidentiary standards. So it is not just about the substantive law which provides rights to women. It is also about procedural and evidentiary standards. So one of the examples is the procedure for reporting rape. So there is this expectation that as soon as rape happens, immediately the woman will rush to the police station and lodge the FIR. And if there is a delay in her going and lodging the FIR, then that becomes a ground on which the defense counsel can then say, oh, she has delayed. That means she probably thought about it and then she has exaggerated it. It may not be the truth. So this is something that feminists have been analyzing and critiquing, and they've been saying that it is not easy for a woman to immediately go to the police station. She would probably tell somebody close to her, like her mother or her sister, but in some situations, the concept of shame and social stigma is so strong that she may not even want to do that. So it becomes very difficult, and sometimes it is only after days and weeks that she is able to make a report of the rape. This is particularly in situations of caste-based violence or communal violence. It is even more difficult for a woman to immediately go to the police station. She may be fleeing into the forest. She may not have confidence in the police because she has seen the police standing and doing nothing when the caste-based violence or the communal violence was happening. So this is one area in which procedural and evidentiary standards have been critiqued by the feminists. Then we have judgments. We have Mathura judgment, Bhavri Devi judgment, Tarun Tejpal, Rajesh Sharma judgment, which was on domestic violence, and it actually, Rajesh Sharma judgment was one which talked about how women misuse the law related to domestic violence. And so there has to be a committee set up. This committee has to first examine whether what the woman is saying is correct or not. Only then the FIR should be lodged. This particular judgment was criticized a lot by the feminists, and afterwards, this was also overruled by a subsequent judgment of the Supreme Court. But I'm quoting this to say how feminists have been critiquing this. Farooqi case, which Dr. Wahida Nainot mentioned yesterday. So, this thing about soft consent, soft yes, and so the whole understanding of consent and how that gets constructed. Institutions. So looking at police, armed forces, judiciary, educational institutions, religious institutions, medical institutions, human rights institutions, political institutions, media. So examining all these institutions which have some connection with the law. So it is part of the feminist project also to look at these institutions. And lastly, on programs and policies, So, for example, the relief packages in Orissa, I remember after there were anti-Christian violence in Kandhamal in Orissa, there were relief packages which were given, but those relief packages did not take into account women's specific needs. There were no sanitary pads there. There were no undergarments that were there. There were no medicines or food for lactating women. So the relief packages kept in mind only a man and what is it that the man required. So the women's groups in Orissa then prepared a list of all the things that the relief packages should have, and then they had a dialogue with the Orissa government so that this could be included. So that's just an example of how part of what feminist critique does is to also look at programs and policies. For example, COVID and the lockdown that happened. So during the lockdown, looking at what was women's experiences. And we know for a fact that during the lockdown, women went through a lot more domestic violence. And there are various studies which are talking about this. So I think I've run out of time. I have more slides, but I don't have the time. I think I will end my presentation here.
I think you can summarize, but show all. No? Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So feminist advocacy initiatives, lawmaking, drawing from women's lived experiences. Professor Vibhuti Patel talked earlier about lived experiences, women's lived experiences. So one example is the Domestic Violence Act. So though the act was made in 2005, but for almost 5 to 6 years prior to that, there were consultations in various parts of the country. And these consultations brought together the forms of domestic violence that women experienced at the ground level, and also what were their varied experiences in relation to reporting to the police, experiences within the house, and so on. So the law came to be shaped through women's experiences. So that is one example. And the other example is Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013, about which I think Wahida talked quite a bit yesterday, so I won't really go into it. I also want to just highlight some of the positive judgments, because very often we think that a feminist critique of the law is only about focusing on the negative judgments and critiquing that, but it's also about celebration of positive judgments. So Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan, which talked about sexual harassment at workplace and gave detailed guidelines, and so many others. Joseph Shine, which I mentioned a little earlier. Indian Young Lawyers Association is the case related to Sabrimala. Shafin Jahan, where the adult women's right to choice in marriage and religious conversion were upheld. So there are various judgments which are positive, and it's also about celebrating those and using those judgments to create awareness about rights. How can feminisms enrich the law? Feminisms can examine legal concepts, so working towards inclusivity. By looking at legal concepts, rules, doctrines, and processes through standpoint of women's experiences. Feminisms can critique the mismatch between women's realities, women's lived realities and law's presumptions. So by looking at this gap between the two, it actually addresses ground realities. Third, feminisms highlight patriarchal interests which are served by this mismatch. So by looking at who does it serve by having this kind of a mismatch or a gap between the law and the reality, by looking at that and focusing on that, it moves towards equality. Fourth, feminists counter the myths about women accessing the law. So as I've already mentioned about women misusing the law, women exaggerating, women lying, and they should not be believed. So it is towards making the legal system women friendly and women sensitive. Feminisms resist institutions' prejudice against women, whether it is the police or it is the judiciary or any other institution. So this is towards bringing institutional accountability. And lastly, feminisms identify structural bias against women. So what is it within the structures of the society? What is it that that subordinates women? And those are identified so that we move towards access to justice. I end with that. Thank you, Professor Vibhuti Patel, for allowing me to complete my slides. And I've given here some of the readings. So there are 14 readings which can be used by anybody who's interested in it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Uma ma'am, for taking out time for us for such an insightful session. I would quickly like to invite Professor Patel to provide her remarks on Uma's presentation, after which we'll move on to questions. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Soumya Uma for excellent time management, such a broad canvas and comprehensive understanding with most appropriate illustrations that given. The unique aspect of her lecture is the processes that go in the legal system. I think that's very important, I found. And I think how the law, which talks about stability, also ends up maintaining status quo. I think that is a very important learning that we had. The ideology of victim blaming and the limitations of law she has shown. And also at the end, she also gave that, yes, that we can use the judicial route for the gender justice concerns. So I think it is a very important this thing she has intervention that she has made. I also wanted her to tell about the exercise which they have started about reading the judgments and how the existing judgments with misogyny and victim blaming ideology, how do you make your students sensitized and give the feminist perspective through that exercise. So I think that would be very useful. In fact, we can use this thing in all disciplines, not only in the legal studies. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, we'd like to move on to questions. There are 3-4 questions as I can see. Ma'am, would you like to take them yourself, or should I read it out? I think I should read it out. It'll be easier.
No, I can see
Okay.
the questions, but very briefly, I just want to take on Professor Vibhuti Patel's suggestion about so I'll mention very briefly what is it that we do. What we do is called feminist rewriting of judgments. So this is an exercise that I have done for my students of feminist jurisprudence whenever I've been able to teach the course. So they take any one judgment and then they look at that judgment using the feminist lens. So it could be a judgment related to it need not be directly related to women. It could be something on property, something on tax, something on sedition. It could be any judgment where they feel that they can use the feminist principles and they can rewrite that judgment. So this particular kind of an exercise. It happens worldwide. Feminist rewriting judgments project is a worldwide project, and I was fortunate to be part of the India initiative. So I rewrote the Sabrimala judgment, not the Supreme Court one, but the Kerala High Court judgment. I rewrote that, and that got published in Indian Law Review. But right now I'm part of a feminist judgment writing project in relation to the International Criminal Court, where we are looking at judgments of the International Criminal Court and trying to rewrite that through a feminist lens. So I think this is a very good exercise to be able to first we understand the feminist principles, and then how do we apply it to any given judgment. So that's something that we do. Thank you for that question, so that I could bring that experience. I'm just looking at the question and answers. Should I, is there time for me to answer them right away, or should I type in my answers? What would you suggest?
I think if you can combine all of them and answer, that's fine. Otherwise, you can write. Yeah.
Okay. I haven't read all of them.
Some you have already taken care of in your lecture, but only one which is very this thing about the relationship. That is really very important.
Which one is it? The first one,
live-in relationship. Yeah.
Goswami.
Yeah.
Okay. How can live-in relationships be seen through a feminist lens? In light of the recent live-in murder cases like Shraddha murder case across India, how should law include a feminist perspective? What concerns need to be dealt by law while considering live-in relationship through a feminist lens? Thank you very much for that question, Devanshi. Let me, so one aspect is that any kind of a relationship should be consensual, right? So this is a feminist approach to it, and feminists have a very strong critique of the institution of marriage itself. So while many feminists, including me, are married, we also critique the institution of marriage itself as something which is oppressive for women, as something which curbs women's fullest potential, and also marriage and family as a site of violence against women. So I think there is a critique of marriage itself. Now, as compared to the institution of marriage, a live-in relationship is always better in that sense, because it is consensual. It is not, it doesn't have those ramifications of the institution of marriage. When you talk about Shraddha Walkar's case, what I want to point out here is that very often we don't think about the natal family and what is their responsibility. Now, even if we look at Shraddha Walkar's case, and this is something that I said a couple of months ago when I talked in Prajna for their annual report, Shraddha Walkar's case has been, if we look at how the media has covered it, either it is looked at as a Hindu-Muslim issue, so it is communal, it is made communal, as if among Hindu couples, this doesn't happen. We know that there have been at least 2-3 other cases, including
I have written in the chat box also their names.
Yes.
So this meant only 2 live-in partners.
Yeah, with where also in live-in relationships there have been these very brutal murders. So the murder is not because there is a live-in relationship. The murder happens also because there is no family support for the woman, because these are relationships where a woman's parents do not support her. It could be interreligious, it could be intercaste, it could be interclass, or even if they belong to the same class, the very fact that women are asserting their right to choice, that itself goes against parents' understanding that they own their daughter. So when women do not have the support of their family members, they are under a pressure to make their relationship work. Even if that live-in relationship has a lot of violence, like in Shraddha's case, we now know that there were months and months of violence. And she had even told one of her friends that, please rescue me, otherwise you're only going to see me dead. So she was able to foresee it, but she was not able to escape from it. If she had the family support, she would have been able to escape from it. So what is the feminist perspective in it? The feminist perspective, I think, is that women's choice, whether it is to marriage or it is to intimate relationships, that should actually be respected.
And also the network of support, social capital.
Yes. Yes.
And I think every day 3 women are killed due to dowry in the National Crime Records Bureau. So whether it's a frying pan or fire, that's the situation if you are powerless. Thank you. There are 7 questions for you. You can answer them in the chat box.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Linda Lindstein.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite our second expert for today's session, Professor Linda Lane, who will be speaking on feminism and intersectionality. Professor Lane is the senior lecturer, Department of Social Work, University of Gothenburg, Sweden. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to share my screen now, but I would first of all like to thank IMPRI for inviting me to participate in this illustrious gathering, and to all of the participants who have actually agreed to participate here to hear what I have to say. So I hope that this will be an enlightening presentation. First of all, I just want to say a few words about...
Ma'am, if you suggest we can share it.
Yeah. Is that better now?
No,
Fine.
Ma'am, we can share it so that you can have your notes. You can stop sharing and we can share. Ashwas.
Okay. That's good. Yes. Then I will do that. I will stop
you can stop the share. Yeah, Ashwas, go ahead.
So I would just like to say in the beginning here that I'm coming from a very specific context, and I think it is kind of important that I make that very clear, that my position here as a person speaking on intersectionality is very much a standpoint, a position where I'm, as a Black American feminist, I live in Sweden. I do research on women primarily in a Western context. And within that, I think it would be kind of important for you as an informed audience to kind of want to question what are my credentials? What do I have to bring to this kind of conversation where we are talking primarily about an Indian context and about the situation for feminism and intersectionality in the Indian context. Now, from my position, I can honestly say I won't be, I have no answers for this. I'm just going to, I can't offer any solutions, kind of to the problem, but I will try to provide some alternatives, some ideas about approaches that we can use to make feminism, as I see it, more inclusive. So next slide, please. So in this, in 2 days now, you've learned a lot about feminism, and I'm not going to go through this again. My reason for framing it this way is primarily for my own benefit, since I missed the first 2 days of the course due to work here in Sweden. But my intention is not to dwell on this, but merely to remind you of how far we've come. By looking at these various waves, you can see how feminism has developed. And I'm sure you've learned through the lectures that have been previously, how much they have contributed to the way we understand feminism and feminisms today. Next slide, please. On the other hand, I think it's very important that we discuss some of the things the problems that have been associated with understandings of feminism. Or for me, the question is has always been, where do I fit in? That is, where do I, as this Black American feminist, sometimes my students call it wannabe. I want to be a feminist, but where do I fit in? Where are my experiences and how are they presented within much of what we discuss in our classrooms about feminist theory? And what we know by looking at this timeline that I presented previously, and where Professor Uma and I'm sure others have already discussed, is that much of feminist theory has been written from the perspective of white, upper middle class, heterosexual, college-educated married mothers. Now, of course, this is not exclusive their view, but it has been, I would say, limited in some respects. And as we see through the various waves of feminisms, how this has been deconstructed, we've opened up the view of feminist theory for it to be more representative of the experiences of lots of other women. On the other hand, the concerns about inequality and some of the things that have been discussed, they are valid and important, and they have been neglected because the category of woman has not been, I guess you can say, deconstructed. We had one vision of what woman, the category of woman, should be. And that means that we don't actually always see the complications around what it means to be defined as woman. There's also, in my view, and this is, I think it's substantiated in the literature, there's been a failure to acknowledge privilege. That is, some groups have been and are still more privileged than others. It's not, a crime to be privileged. It's a crime to not acknowledge it and see that privilege gives advantages to some and not to others. So in my view, successive waves of feminism or feminist study and feminism, feminist activism has struggled with this. And they have tried to always continue to fight for more inclusivity, to be more open, to see all of the various categories, if you will, of woman, of womanness, if you will. Next slide, please. So in the brief amount of time that I have here today, what I want to do is to kind of trouble the seemingly linear, better and better day by day view of the development of feminist thought and feminism. I want to complicate this in ways that I think that intersectionality can open the doors for maybe a better understanding. I don't know if it's going to change the hearts and minds of you as listeners, but I think it would. Maybe we can find some common ground about the things that we agree on and those that we disagree upon. And I will do this by, first of all, introducing and defining intersectionality, again, from my own specific context. I would like to try to put intersectionality in a kind of historical perspective as well. And by discussing how intersectionality, I believe, can contribute to making feminism or feminisms more inclusive. Next slide, please. So why do we need this? My students often ask, what does intersectionality bring to the table? What does it do that we haven't already done, or that can't be discussed within the framework of feminism or feministic theory? Well, as I've pointed out a few minutes ago, some of the things that critics or people who are advocating, like myself, for an intersectionality perspective bring is that we want to fill those holes that other feminist descriptions of women's experiences have not been able to fill. We want to detail the ways in which women of color, poor people, poor women, women from various races and ethnicities, and other experiences, how they differ in the world. The feminist movement, as conceived, we feel, did not take an intersectional approach. And in that respect, it kind of alienates women of various groups who might not feel that the movement is for them. As an example, the American feminist movement, in its historical development, has done everything from excluding Black women to segregating them into various smaller categories, or to claiming to not know about Black women or women of color or Latino women or other women or indigenous women. It's a way of kind of distancing themselves from other groups. So it's not, it's not strange that women of color maybe felt that the feminist movement was not for them. And this was specifically around issues around voting rights, the suffrage, but also around discrimination in workplaces. So we can see that as feminism has developed, there's become a wider need, if you will, for groups to kind of recognize one another's differences, but not see differences as something that separates us, but something that can actually contribute to the movement as such. So practicing a feminism is not intersectional, I feel, ignores the reality that not all women share all other axes of identity. We are not alike. We have differences, but they don't necessarily need to divide us. For me, intersectional feminism is a theoretical approach, and it is used to analyze, to tease out the ways that multiple systems of oppression are enacted in space and time. So what happens historically in one place might not be the same in another, and it might not be the same groups who are oppressed in the same ways, but that doesn't detract from the fact that if we use an intersectional perspective to view them, we see new things. So next slide, please. And in this slide, I'm just going to take a step back in history. This is for a picture of Sojourner Truth, a former slave in the United States of America. But she is also one of the first people to, I guess you could say, anticipate an intersectional perspective. And we can see this in the way that she talks about the changes that are coming in the American context. This speech was written in, I think, in the 1850s. And she's talking at a conference, a women's conference. So we get two things here. We get the historical perspective, and we get the view that women are talking to each other about things that concern them. In this quote, she says, well, children, there is much racket being made. Something is out of kilter. Something is going on. We are talking about rights. And just now, I think the white man is pretty soon going to be in a fix. Now, she's opening it up for a discussion of men who are raising the issues about why women should not have the suffrage, because women don't need they don't need to be free or to be independent. They need to be protected by men. And I'm thinking along the lines of what Professor Umma said in her presentation here, that women of some, even historically, have been seen as not being fully competent to take care of themselves. But she challenges this and she says, well, okay, white men want to protect white women. They feel that they need to be helped out of carriages and lifted and carried and get the best of everything. But look at me, I'm a Black woman. No one opens any doors for me. Am I less a woman because you don't? Am I less a woman because I work really hard and I have plowed and I've raised children? All of these things I have done. Does that make me less a woman? Now, of course, when we talk about intersectionality, we might not recognize this as a speech about intersectionality, given the time period. But I think we can read it that way because she's challenging us to look at how we perceive differences among women based on ideas about what women should be and not who they actually are. Of course, this is an early statement. There are many, many others going back in time, but around the 1960s, 70s, when the second wave movement really got underway in the United States, which was more or less conjoined with the civil rights movement at the same time, we have other groups, you know, we have Angela Davis, the Combahee River Collective, the Alan Sanduwa, who was talking about the situation for Chicanos, and they were all discussing dimensions of social difference in many ways. But I think the way we talk about intersectionality today kind of emerged in the late 1980s with the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. Next slide, please. In many ways, she's kind of attributed with, you know, kind of lifting intersectionality to where it is today in terms of a formal definition of intersectionality and trying to look at it from a way that kind of encapsulates all of these kinds of things that we've been talking about as regard women of color. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer. And like Professor Uma, much of what she does in terms of the relationships, the way she discusses intersectionality emerges from her background in the law. And I think, I mean, for those of you who might know of her or have read her work, you know that she looks at Black women's position in the labor market and the way they are discriminated, not only on the basis of their race, but also on the basis of their gender, and that the law at the time in the United States could not do both. It could not see women as both Black and women and working women. It could just see them as one race, you know, it's racial discrimination or it's gender discrimination. So in this respect, she kind of raises these issues and helps us to understand how we can use intersectionality to see the oppressiveness of laws. The ones that Professor Uma, you know, talked about is supposedly being gender neutral, which of course they are not. Next slide, please. Now, Crenshaw has three critical aspects of intersectionality that I think are kind of important here. And normally when I talk about this for my students, I use her law examples, but I think we can open up this discussion even more about kind of looking at other types of examples. For example, she talks about structural intersectionality, and that refers to the experiences of people within a specific category and how they differ depending on their intersectional identities. And I think, you know, one of the things we can lift here, especially in the European context now, especially after 2015-16 with the rush on borders by the Syrian immigrant crisis, is how do we talk about the combination of, say, immigrant status unemployment, and the experience of domestic violence. And we can see the same kind of thing that Professor Uma mentioned emerging during the COVID crisis with the COVID epidemic, with people unsure of their economic status, unemployment, and this kind of forced contact with each other. Political intersectionality concerns the experiences of multiple disadvantaged groups and how that shapes the construction of collective identities. Now, for me, one of the examples that we often use is the missing white woman syndrome. And maybe you have the same kind of analogy in the Indian context. If something happens to a woman from a high status group, then it's all ears. Everybody is listening. Nobody talks about the disappearance of poor women of color, prostitutes, transgender people. All of these are considered not newsworthy, or they don't get marked at all. And I'm talking here about police, I'm talking about the law, I'm talking about social services. So you have this idea that one group is, in this case, white women, get a lot more attention just because they are white women. Now, political intersectionality helps us to understand how we can use, how laws, media, legal views, institutions kind of position us to only see the majority, the dominant groups, that somehow we don't see those who are further down in the hierarchy, which makes it much less, or how can I put it? It's not as easy to form coalitions between groups to kind of try to work this out in a new way, to find new ways of framing agendas, to make different choices about how we can impact institutions. For example, how can we as non-white women work together in a political coalition to change this view about, for example, this, prioritizing missing white women, if you will. Now, the representational institutionality talks about how cultural roles, imagery, plays in producing and reinforcing hierarchies linked to race, gender, and other social categories. And of course, this was very much a part of the lecture that Professor Uma gave about how our views of what women should be impact the way we see what they are able to do. Now, just as an aside, I don't know very much about the Indian case, but I could just mention that in Sweden, speaking about partnered relationships, that is the norm here. Most people don't marry. I mean, marriage, well, people do marry, but they marry much later. Maybe they marry when they have children or when they're considering having children, but most people have lived or live in some kind of live-in partnership. However, and I think this is important, living in a partnered relationship without marriage does not mean that there is less violence. Married couples kill, men in married families perpetrate violence on their wives. So my point is, being married is not a protection from violence. And, so if you're married, deadly violence is there. If you're not, deadly violence is there. Next slide, please. What intersectionality does, and I think is very important, it is that it provides, it recognizes the interconnectedness of social identities. It acknowledges that all women are different, that we have different experiences of oppression. And it emphasizes the need for feminist movements to be more inclusive and diverse. That is, we bring the marginalized voices to the center. We want to not keep them in the margin. And we must recognize that centering the experiences of the marginalized can create discomfort, if you will, or conflict within dominant groups. Next slide, please. one of the people who I've, spent a lot of time trying to understand and engaging with is Patricia Hill Collins, and she's a feminist who tries to use intersectionality. She wants to bring the framework to the forefront, but she's not there to change the theory. She's more interested in trying to look at what we can do with intersectionality. So next slide, please. So some of her aims is not so much to talk so much about the theory, but she asks questions like, what is intersectionality? Is it the same for everybody? Why did it emerge? Who did it come from? By whom? Who is it for? What kind of relationships and analysis can we use it for? So she wants to interrogate what intersectionality is. And we can see that since the early 1990s, when she's writing, that lots of different ways of thinking about intersectionality has emerged. It depends on which field of study you're interested in, and you can see this in different ways. The next thing that she wants to talk about it is as an analytical strategy, and she talks about, how can we rethink things like the family, rethinking work? How can we see them in relation to, by expanding the categories of race, class, and gender to include things like nation, ethnicity, age, and ability. And third, she highlights, one of the things that I really appreciate about her is this business of doing intersectionality and how we do it together with others in our work for social justice. So she concentrates a lot on working with local and grassroots organizations, often composed of populations whose views might not have come to the forefront. So it's a way of kind of being more inclusive by going back down to the basics again. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that intersectionality has, it has been questioned. A lot of people wonder, is it for us, as we've pointed out before? And Matri, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Chaudhary. She argues that,
Maitreyi Chaudhary, Professor Maitreyi.
Yeah, Maitreyi, thank you, Chaudhary. She talks about this in her book about, the fact that from the Indian context, Western feminists have not really, engaged in a way. It's been, they have not really seen the problems that are associated with colonialism, for example. And perhaps she's right. I'm not the person to say, but I think by being inclusive of an intersectionality perspective, we can link these various forms of subjugation, those that occur under colonialism and colonialism coupled to patriarchy, with various forms of radical and standpoint feminism, where we can kind of together oppose these, by recognizing that, okay, these systems of power and oppression, we must struggle together for women's liberation, and they must be part of a broader struggle for social justice and equality. So just having that as a background makes it, kind of possible for us to view things a little differently. Next slide, please. So here I'd just like to say a few words about how, by asking if intersectionality can travel, because a lot of discussions have been raised about that. Is intersectionality, as we see it in the United States, what's the difference between what is practiced in Europe? What is done in India? Lots of questions about, what it is, who it's for. Back to Patricia Colin Hills. But if we look at the way it's been used and, the way we try to think about it, we find that in the EU, we don't really talk about race. And that has in a historical context. It's about, after Nazism, Second World War, it's, we don't talk that much, whether in research or in our writings about it that way, whereas in America, race is very much a viable issue. But here in the European context, we've tried to use intersectionality to talk more about multi-dimensional intersections of race, religion, sexuality, and talk about it from a position of multiple discrimination factors. On the global level, we are seeing more in terms of organizations trying to find ways of reaching each other to make connections over international borders, more transnational views of how can we join hands together to discuss possibilities for connections across social movements to, again, for social justice. And again, we have something that we often talk about in terms of strategic intersectionality, where you want to bring forth this kind of cooperation between feminisms of different ethnicities to see what we have in common, not only what we what the differences between us are. So next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to say very much about this at this point, but I just want to mention that, you know, we are now in a kind of backlash. Globalization and neoliberalism has refashioned all these old ideas that we thought we had solved, you know, they're rising to the fore again. And we can say that they are starting to again to question whether or not feminist research actually brings anything new. Everybody is talking about, oh, well, women are in the labor market now, they're becoming more independent. But very few people are looking at these global interactions, how global chains of labor, global chains of migration are impacting women in various different ways. So, you know, we are seeing a rise again of things, you know, kind of this kind of area where we thought about was decolonialization or post-colonialization. They're being reconstructed in today's global societies, where, you know, the United States, for example, is really very closely tied to women's underpay, poor working conditions, inabilities to really to feed their families through their colonialization of, say, for example, Mexico, their use of global capital to really kind of put women in underordered positions, or the garment trade between the United States, Sweden, for example, and Bangladesh or Turkey, where women's labor is being used in ways that is detrimental to them, but to the benefit of global capital. So I think we have to kind of keep this in mind when we talk about the way we are going. And I think that intersectionality can offer a way for us to see this by focusing us to observe how these dynamics of global capitalism, shape the way we do feminisms. Next slide, please. So this was you know, very quick in a way, but I'm open for more depth, if you will. But I think I think we can just on this very short view, we can say that intersectionality has made some contributions to the way we think about feminism and women in the world. Bell Hooks, she says, you know, intersectionality really challenged the notion that gender was the primary factor determining a woman's fate. And Leslie McCall talks about the way that intersectionality has, and the development of theory has focused on the experiences of people who were subjected to multiple forms of oppression within society. That said, I think it's very important to note now, especially in the American context, that intersectionality is being challenged. It is being critiqued. And, you know, and I'm sure that it's the same in the Indian context, that, you know, it's being considered as dangerous, that it's, you know, it's saying, well, non-feminist or conservative groups are claiming that intersectionality means just identity politics, that it's all about, you know, helping or promoting under, you know, minority groups to claim rights, to make them dependent, that that intersectionality leads to identity politics, which leads to social divisions, and, you know, all of these things, that it's, you know, it's dangerous for society. And that being a victim is the, you know, is what intersectionality brings to it. It tells people that they're victims. And you can see it in things like people challenging equal rights amendments. Roe versus Wade is, you know, among those. Maybe, you know, trying to revoke civil rights gains, equal rights, equal law, equal opportunity, access to employment, these are to education. So these things are being brought up. But Kimberly Crenshaw was actually asked in an interview, you know, talk about this. What is the problem? And she says, well, okay, when we look at the research and we look at what is being done, we find that even these critics of intersectionality, they would agree that it's nothing wrong with the theory. They agree that there are differences in the lived lives of many people. What is the problem is they don't want to accept the consequences of an intersectionality perspective. That is, it demands that we see things different. And they feel threatened by that. That means that we're going to change, you know, an intersectionality view changes the status quo, and people in hierarchies of power don't want to be challenged because they feel that they might have something to lose. Next slide, please. So, in my opinion, I think that an intersectionality perspective is crucial to us as activists who are interested in working for social justice. And it allows us to see whether movements that mobilize for economic justice or social justice really take into account class differences that intersect with race, gender, and other forms of inequality. And it highlights the roles that, you know, that class, gender play in various social movements. And, you know, I just like to end my presentation with a small quote from Audre Lorde. And she was critiquing the fact that, in this case, the white American women's movement had not considered what Black women or women of color could bring to white feminist movements or to make the feminist movement more inclusive. And she writes, as women, we've been taught either to ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion, rather than as forces for change. For those of us who stand outside the circle of society's definition of acceptable women, we know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. But the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. We're indeed very grateful to have you with us. Without further ado, I'd like to move on and would like to invite our professor, VIBHUTI Patel, to provide her remarks.
Yeah, I think I am really highly impressed by Professor Linda Lane's brilliant presentation with a cross-cultural perspective. I liked her quote also that it is a crime not to acknowledge privilege. Yes, very important. What we need is more inclusivity. I'm so happy that she introduced us to the heroic life of Sojourner Truth and Patricia Hill. The way intersectionality, the structural intersectionality, political intersectionality, representational intersectionality, multidimensional intersections, and strategic intersectionality, the way she has unpacked them, and also provided the political context in the whole global capitalism and how it uses women as a colony and the cheapest labor. I think it's very, very important to understand. And she also enlightened us about the conservative backlash that we are facing in Indian context in the name of meritocracy, that why no affirmative action, they are the ones, and that you can see also in the union budgets where all the social sector support and the affirmative actions have been withdrawn by the state. So it is globally also feminists are challenged, and I think that's why our responsibility increases in furthering the intersectional perspective. I think one question which is very important for you, there are 6 questions for you, but one is about womanism. What are your views on womanism?
Hoy. I wish I had a you know, like a 1, 2, 3 answer, but I don't. For me, I think it depends on, you know, how we talk about inclusivity. You know, which women are we talking about, and what does feminism, you know, how we defined it, and how inclusive we want to be about it. Now, I'm coming from another background, from a completely different context, and we don't really talk about womanism in that respect. I guess you could say historically, when we talk about it, it has really been about something that was very much a part of the discourse when essentialism and women's separate sphere and, you know, discussion was very much at the focus. Since the 1960s, 70s, we don't really have a lot of that being discussed in the literature or in the classroom. On the other hand, we can say that there is a strand of feminism that focuses very much on women as being, you know, something completely different. We have different, our bodies are different. We are essentially different from men, you know, focusing on the idea that we have more, I guess you could say, because of our nurturing abilities, we are much more in focus around children caring and such, that kind of thing. I haven't done any research on that area. So, I mean, perhaps that's the best I can say at this point. I don't really think that's a very good answer, but I don't really have very much more to add there.
Yeah. You can read other questions. There are 9 questions for you.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You
can answer on
see.
chat box. Yeah. Some important ones you can take up. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question about what are your thoughts on womanism? I don't really have so much to add there. How do you, as an academic researcher, engage with intersectionality within your theoretical? Well, that for me is the core, is trying to figure out, you know, a lot of people talk about intersectionality. You can, if you read a policy document, everybody, the United Nations, my government here in Sweden, everybody talks about intersectionality. They name it. They name, you know, oh, we are going to consider this, that, and the other. But then when you ask, how are you going to do this? Then they say, oh, it's complicated. And, you know, and you say, but then maybe the fact that it's complicated is just that part that needs to be teased out, yeah, to be discussed more in depth. So as a practical example, I can say, you know, from my research, we look at, which would be a good example, I'm thinking now, we look at sexual harassment in the workplace. And of course, women and men and other groups are harassed. And we're talking about sexual harassment. This is where people are touching you or calling you names or, you know, about who you are and things like that. And of course, the law says that you should not be discriminated in the workplace, of course not. But what do you do when the law does not, again, very much in the same strain as it is in the United States, it doesn't recognize the fact that you can be discriminated because you are both a woman, a Black person, and you might be an underordinate, have some kind of subordinate position in your workplace. So we try to help organizations understand that you can't separate women or groups of women from each other. You have to look at them together by recognizing that even women as a group are different. We don't have the same experiences. So that's hard. That's hard for organizations. That's hard for the law, because they want to have things strict and straight. They want to be able to identify everything directly. And when they can't, they get worried and it becomes complicated. So that's just one way that I try to work with this. This kind of post-colonial idea. I don't really have a lot of knowledge of post-colonial feminisms, except trying to see how they are linked to Western feminisms and the way they critique Western feminisms. And in that respect, I always offer intersectionality as a gap there, as a way of filling that gap, of linking the two together. In terms of looking at workplaces and this kind of globalization under new liberalism, that I think is something we really must start to take very serious, because this view that, that more capital, globalization is good for everybody. It isn't. It is not good for everybody. I think it was, I don't know, one of these male economists said one time, well, in the long run, everybody is dead. That is true, but how long will women have to wait before they see some improvements, around these globalization issues? And we see that women fare worse in terms of migration. They are the ones who are trafficked, for example. Even though there are more men who are being trafficked, the women who are trafficked or who are in these migratory processes are the ones who fare the worst. We've just done some recent research that shows that women meet sexual violence. They, they're humiliated. They are forced for sexual engagement with guards, with people who are there who are supposed to be protecting them. So we're looking at this and saying, well, yeah, who are these women? They are, in this case, people who are want to enter the West or Europe for a better life, but they're, so it's problematic. Let me see. Is the token feminism effect has gained more traction in main media? We see where certain sections of women are celebrated for breaking barriers. Yeah, I agree. This always happens. Britikaya, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but you have this idea that, everybody's a feminist now, but that doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. I mean, I'm not so sure that everybody who claims to be a feminist is a feminist. When you see some of the actions that are taking place, and we see that many of these people who are claiming to be feminists, in their actions, the way in their activism, in their day-to-day, what they do, are not the characteristics of an activist, and definitely not the characteristics of a feminist for me, but that's me. So I don't judge. I just observe that category of people who have those characteristics are not people I would consider to be feminist. The question is, would emphasizing intersectionality differences further divide women's movement? It might. But is that, it would force us to realize that we are different. And then we, as Audre Lorde says, maybe when we recognize this difference, maybe we see that difference is nothing to be afraid of. that in our differences, we can still engage. And I think that is, you have nothing to lose but fear itself. So, yeah, it might happen. And we're seeing it in Black organizations. We're seeing it in, where suddenly you realize that even in these groups, there are upper class people, there are underclass people, there are working class people, they're educated, they're uneducated. How are we going to come together? So the question is, do we consider this issue so important that we are prepared to make the time and effort to deal with the differences and then to come together with the strengths? So maybe I should stop now. I don't
Yeah,
know.
because you have taken care of other two. Devanshi,
Yeah,
you have already
I think
taken
this
care
is
of. Yeah, the last one, no? Devanshi Goswami, you have answered. It was
I think so.
covered that point in your lecture, in your speech also.
So, my email is with IMPRI. So if there are other questions, feel free.
Or you can
to
write in the
contact
chat
me.
box also, your email ID. They can write
Yeah,
it.
I will.
I have-
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We're indeed very grateful for having you with us. We'd like to move on with our final and third speaker for today's session. That is Professor Vijayalakshmi Nanda, who will be speaking on feminism and discourse on rights in India. Professor Nanda is the principal and professor of political science, Miranda House, University of Delhi. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would thank you very much. Thanks, IMPRI, for this opportunity. I'll be sharing my screen for my presentation. I hope you can see that, and let me know. Can you see that now?
No, ma'am. Please
Not
try.
yet. I've shared my. Have you allowed me sharing?
Yes.
So I have shared it. Just a minute. Wait. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Wait a minute.
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's in working mode. Make it in.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah, okay. So I am using a earlier, presentation that I've used earlier with IMPRI, but just thought it would be useful to have that. Can you see it now? Yes. Is it clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I will be taking you through a journey of the feminist discourse on rights by looking at a case study of sex-selective abortion in India. While I will be talking about the case study in detail, but my major job here would be to walk through the various feminist discourse that are there on rights, especially taking from the Western idea of feminist discourse, as well as some of the Indian kind of theories that have emerged. Now, we have had a huge competing discourse of rights, which are informed by feminist perspectives, both at local, national, and global levels, that provide various understandings of how we need to look at women's bodies or reproductive rights, or how reproductive rights and women's bodies are interlinked. And they become competing areas. There are contradictions, there are contestations, there are challenges. We did hear about the intersectionality approach, very useful to use that. Other thing that I approach here and what I talk about here is the syncretic feminist perspective, because one particular idea of feminism does not really provide us all the answers. And I agree with the earlier presentation by Professor Linda Lane, that we need to engage with a number of perspectives. And sometimes when it comes to praxis, we might need to have a more syncretic approach. So I am going to be talking about those kinds of theories and try to make some kind of an argument here, and we can have a conversation. Here, I would like you to look at this very beautiful saying by Joshua Cohen, which says that when we look at justice, and here we are looking at gender justice, it demands our devotion as well as understanding It must grip our emotions. We must feel its absence and presence with the depth of feeling that we associate with love. And this is present in a writing by Martha Nussbaum, where she talks in detail about why the idea of love matters for justice. And why I'm talking about love, because this is also another understanding around feminism, that somewhere we remain devoid of the idea of love because somehow it escapes political theorizing. But in the case study I present here, it is an important point to discuss the idea of love, because it is related to what I'm going to discuss here. I also use a quotation from Maria Mies, who says that even to understand a thing, the feminist discourse always is to change it, is to deconstruct, is to examine it, or to look at it from another perspective, from a perspective or using a gender lens. So I think that's what we're going to do here. This is a cover of the famous left-oriented journal, The Economist, which says, gendercide, what happened to 100 million baby girls? While we are supposedly talking about rights and rights of baby girls, the understanding that is emerging from this from a feminist perspective can be equally problematic. And we will discuss that when we have the conversation. What is wrong with this kind of a terminology or this kind of a language? Now, yes, in India, we have had a declining child sex ratio, and that declining child sex ratio, as you can see from the numbers, has been declining over the past almost, so many decades, from 61 to 71 to 81 to 91 to 2011. We don't have a census now. I believe there have been some improvements, but we will know when the census comes. Now, this particular phenomenon of the number of girls decreasing to boys in the 0 to 6 age group has been recognized that it has happened because of a strong son preference or daughter aversion, then the misuse of medical technology or reproductive technology in order to terminate female fetuses. Now, it seems simple enough for a feminist perspective to develop on this. However, this has also been the field where most contradictions emerge, and we will walk you through some of those contradictions. Now, let us take a look at even the language of talking about gender-biased, sex-selective abortion or sex selection. The first terminology that came to be used here to talk about what is supposedly called, which is discussed as female feticide, the missing girls in the 0 to 6. So female feticide became the word. And later on, feminist perspectives that emerged, definitely looking at the Roe versus Wade, or looking at issues around abortion rights, female feticide seemed like an overlap over the right to abortion. And that terminology, after a lot of discussions and debates and conversations, that was dropped to talk about sex-selective abortion. So therefore, moving away from the idea of murder or the idea of abortion as murder, and moving to sex-selective abortion as being against women's rights, or the pre-birth elimination of females, or referring to son preference or daughter aversion. And the terrain in this language, the last one was gender-biased sex selection. So therefore, talking about the rights of women and girls, here looking at it almost as competing rights, it was very necessary to use a politically correct terminology so that there is no overlap over the rights that women have. So they become competing rights in so many sense. Reproductive autonomy is an important concept in law and policy, and there are legal supports, and we do know about the Charter of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Now, the consensus that freedom of choice in reproductive matters is essential to map the course of one's life. It exists. However, how do we look at this? How do we engage with this? What are its legal implications? What are its value? That's something that we need to discuss. And there are various different kinds of discourses that have emerged over time. When we look at feminist discourses on rights, there have been various shifts. So there has been the idea of individual rights coming from liberal feminism and what have you, to moving on to group rights, to talking of women as a group and talking about categories, to moving on to engage with intersectionality. And then before intersectionality, recognizing women's rights as human rights, we have had the liberal, socialist, the discourses around, beginning with equal rights to rights of production and reproduction, to looking at radical feminism, to looking at engaging with postmodern feminism, even, kind of deconstructing the very category of women, to the idea of Judith Butler, who questions heteronormativity, to the idea finally, if you engage to intersectionality, which has emerged now as a concept for praxis, because intersectionality more than the theoretical perspective, because if you look at postmodern feminism, then you would take Judith Butler, or for that matter, her idea of strategic essentialism, and I'll come to that. So there are various discourses. So if you take a look at the discourses of rights here, I'm using the case study of sex-selective abortion, but you can use it for any study. So you look at gender equality. And when you look at gender equality, the state discourse would be about numbers. It would be about demography. It would be about the quantitative part. But when it comes to substantive rights, that kind of a discourse, that kind of a discussion is what the feminists push for. And we need to talk about that. The other discourse is about gender justice, and then looking at crime, crime against women. How are we going to engage with that? And I may not have many answers here, but we can discuss this in greater detail. So how do you engage with the idea of crime against women? Do you see this as a social evil, or are we able to engage with all the kinds of violence that is there against women as crime? And how does it engage with the idea of justice? How do you look at rights, and how do you look at ethics? So these are some of the dilemmas that exist in the discourse of rights. Now, when it comes to sex-selective abortion, and you're looking at missing women or missing girls who are being eliminated because of son preference, and the numbers are decreasing because families prefer to have at least one son or at most one son, you are looking at a demand side. So you're looking at gender discrimination. And the state and the feminists, here, there is a certain cooperation of state and feminists both in this. They look at policy statements concerning women and girls coming from a liberal. In India, it's usually a synthetic approach where liberal feminists, let's say Bina Agarwal and others, would be joining hands with socialist feminists like, let's say, Professor VIBHUTI Patel and others, and there would be a certain kind of a synthetic approach. So most academic feminists join hands with feminists, social activists, and this is what they would ask for to the state. There's always a confrontation of the state, but also asking or demanding from the state. Policy statements concerning women and girls, women's empowerment schemes, financial incentive schemes, and bringing about other laws. So there's been a huge work on law that has come through the feminist movement in India, and that has resulted in creating a number of very interesting, very supporting, very enabling laws. So that's the demand side. And we have looked at that. On the supply side, you do have what is called medical, unethical and illegal medical practices, which results in, the doctors communicating, or alternative medical practitioners communicating the sex of the fetus and bringing about sex-selective abortion or even sex selection. And therein, again, there is a law that feminists have asked for. And Professor Patel here has been part of the larger movement. I have been part of the movement where we had the PNDT Act. And I'm just using this as a case study. So the Prenatal Diagnostic Technique Act, where you are looking at prevention of sex determination. And then when the other technologies came in for sex selection, you had Preconception and Prenatal Diagnostic Technique Act, where you even covered that part. So the supply side was also questioned. And here again, we are working closely with the state. So these are the kind of policy response continuum that have been there. Then again, it's very interesting. I'm using this poster to talk about the feminist discourse around reproductive rights. Now, in India, while we talk about reproductive rights, and there has been an enabling movement looking at medical termination of pregnancy, 1971, we got the law, and engaging with safe and legal abortion. For us, the largest struggle has been to see to it that women survive their pregnancy, because maternal mortality was highest. So the struggle over the reproductive body, whereas in the US, they're still struggling. Planned Parenthood is now completely, washed away with the kind of laws that have been brought in many states of the US regarding abortion, limiting abortion rights. In India, our struggle was that the reproductive body has to be about giving them safe. So, something which is very, very important, which is very, very significant, is that surviving pregnancy in India was our right. So when you talked about right, you actually talked about maternal mortality or infant mortality. So just survival, the right to life becomes very important. And herein, we have explored this maternal health care crisis. And this is, happening sometimes in the early 2000s, a little later than that. And now we have had a turnaround due to the Janani Suraksha Yojana or the National Rural Health Mission. And this is how the struggle has been. So this is another area where we have worked. Then how has the state looked at women? Now, when you take a look at the constitutional provisions or the laws that are there, the state gaze on women coming from feminist perspectives is that women are to be litigants. They are going to fight with those laws. They become supplicants, or they are activists, or they are victims, or they are beneficiaries. This has been the large state gaze on women. And this is how the feminists have also worked on this particular issue to recognize that. Feminist engagement with the state has been confrontationist. So whether it is liberal or socialist in India, there is always a syncretic perspective. I do not see much of radical feminism in India. Now, of course, with the LGBTQIA movement, you might find certain sparks of that. Mostly it has been liberal and socialist. So there's been a confrontationist approach where they have confronted the state, enough is enough, let us get our rights, or they have asked for rights, or especially in the Nirbhaya movement, they have marched on streets. There has been reformists. They have worked very closely with the state to reform, or cooperated, or even collaborated. Irrespective of that co-opted idea, feminists in India have worked with the liberal and socialist perspective, have brought about change. So none of these rights that is legally available to us was handed on a platter. Whether you see the Towards Equality report, it's a short presentation, so I can't talk much about it. In 1974, to the feminist movement fighting through these years, I think the women's movement has got us most of our rights, and we must recognize that. There are a set of feminists who have actually said that, and here I bring in the dilemmas of the feminist politics. Dilemma one, should we go with laws or should we go outside the law? So when it comes with the laws, there are feminists, Professor Patel, Mary John, so many others who have said that while there are problems with working with the state, but we cannot go away from the state. We need to find answers within law, and bringing about legal interventions has been the strongest. So that's why they have wanted to go with the law. Let the laws come in. It provides us a certain gatekeeping. It provides us a certain support. There are others like Ratna Kapoor, Nivedita Menon, who have also said that they would rather go outside the law. Look at vibrant movements, that the state law, like more of a radical feminist perspective here, the state is always patriarchal, and it can never really provide you with the answers, and it will bring about greater lack of privacy. There would be too many interventions which will go against women's rights. There is also, for us, especially in sex selective abortion or reproductive rights, the pro-life, pro-choice debate. And in India, it becomes very problematic that feminists have not been able to agree on what is empowering for women. Should we bring about laws which are very stringent, which strike down on abortion, sex selective abortion? How will it overlap over the right to abortion? Here I see a hijacking of the term pro-life by the so-called church and other such bodies, because feminists are not necessarily against life. So the pro-choice here includes pro-life, and we need to include that. So are women, so when we make the, when it comes to sex selective abortion, when we say women are not actively participating, so are we then recognizing women only as passive victims, or can they also be active agents here? And that's the dilemma. Feminist, Manjula Padmanabhan said, maybe it is a right that woman is establishing or she is exercising when she gets rid of what is female within her as a kind of a confrontation with the society which does not recognize the rights of women. So I think there has been also that struggle. So how do we look at that? Then do we ask the state to bribe the families so that they give birth to daughters? Or should we look at a more rights-based approach? Should we go with the state or should we go outside the state? These are some of the dilemmas, and I will walk you through the feminist arguments. So Flavia Agnes, Ratna Kapoor, and Menon, they say that while some feminists say that there should be creation of laws, Others believe laws may themselves become a site of gender discrimination, since they reinforce power and bureaucratic control, and that's there. The other is pro-life versus pro-choice. Here I'm using a particular poster to show that there is actually a confusion when it comes to sex selection. This is posters made by young people, and they do not really see the distinction. They think it is the mother who's eliminating the female fetus. So women are anyway seen as the villain in the piece when it comes to sex selective abortion. And there is really no recognizing them as passive victims. Whereas it is important to recognize that there is social conditioning and coercion and self-esteem issues that needs to be worked on. There's also violence, invisible violence that continues where women are not able to say no here. And here I come to one very important case study. This is in Punjab, where the deputy commissioner who was involved, he did a lot of work around this issue. But when he was trying to bring about trying to control what he saw as gender biased sex selection, the monitoring of pregnancies of women happened. So when you move with a bureaucratic approach, these things happen, and then this monitoring led to various kinds of difficult and different practices which worked against rights of women, and it limited the rights of women without really meaning to do so. And many people felt that it was a very proactive campaign. In fact, it turned around the sex ratio. However, it died a quick death after he left. And it is really driven. And here, how do you look at this delicate balance between monitoring of pregnancy, taking away the rights of women, their privacy? How do you engage with that? Is that the best way to go? So what should that law say? And feminists have had a particular understanding around this. Are women active agents? Now, this is my friend and somebody I've been very close to. She passed away. Her daughters are now 16 years old, 17 maybe now. So she fought a major battle. She was one of the first complainants who talked about how sex determination had taken place, family of doctors, and because she had twin daughters, they forced her for sex selective abortion. She refused. She went for the law, but she did not receive any support, irrespective of a very feminist, comprehensive legislation, which separated it from medical termination of pregnancy and only looked at sex determination. The bureaucratic control, or I hear the bureaucrat is actually a doctor who's examining it, that mindset was not changing. So the need for feminists to work with bureaucrats on gender mainstreaming is extremely important. The next is monetary incentives, and that's been a major idea that has been drawn from Latin American countries, where you look at conditional cash transfers. And here I'm just running you through some, they are basically meant for immediate poverty alleviation, boosting, and this is also coming through feminist perspectives. So Bolsa Familia, Progressa in Mexico, and in India, we had so many schemes, Dhan Lakshmi, Balri Rakshak, and they were mostly providing financial incentives for family, encouraging them so that they stop sex selection and they change their mindset. And I'm just going to rush you through some of them. This is the idea that, and it's all well-meaning, but what is, if you put the feminist lens to it, what was the problem with some of them? It's important to look at. I can revisit. Did they bring about a turnaround in declining child sex ratio? And I did a study of the Ladli scheme, which was there in Delhi earlier, and one realized that it didn't really turn around. I mean, there was a certain, they prioritized it for their daughter's marriage, and they wanted to substantiate the spending on their own. Even the girls wanted to do that. Dowry was recognized as an entrenched practice. So for feminists to look at a holistic perspective was important, and this was there. It also revealed that there would be some change in the second bond order, but by the second order, next order of pregnancy, and this is basically for relatively non-poor sections, because you're looking at a low income level where you're providing it. So John Ray says that it is again reinforcing stereotypes that daughters are liabilities. And the feminist discourse on this is that somewhere you are compartmentalizing and you need to bring it together. So the large-scale feminist interventions, again coming from a liberal, socialist, let's say even intersectionality was used. It was a syncretic feminist perspective with intersectionality that actually led to the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign. And if you take a look at it, it is actually the National Advisory Council which had brought in some of these changes. that led to the strengthening. So you have 3 ministries involved in it. You have implementation of the law. You also have various proposals, especially for education of daughters. Now, of course, you can later on link it with employability. Perhaps that's something that we need to look at. However, there's one thing that I need to engage with here. Apart from dowry, what are the problems with looking at the idea of sexuality of women and how that is related? So therefore, why the spending on marriages? It is not only to do with dowry. The spending on marriages also captures the imagination of young minds, where the significant marker of status and self-worth, the only time they are celebrated is during this particular time. And the wedding and this consumerist idea of marriage and beauty and glamorized idea, and the only time when they're expressing this, the whole idea of who they are, this is something that needs to be looked at. So while some women, there was some security, confidence, larger decision-making roles or bargaining power was not there. So now with the state or without the state, while it keeps, it works very, very closely on this issue, then again, it brings in coercive population policies, especially the two-child norm. And feminists in India have worked very closely with this to say that if you are, and especially, this is work done by Nirmala Buch, by Vidyut Mohanty and others, where they have looked at the Panchayati Raj elections and they have proven that two-child norms have actually worked against the rights of women and also against the rights of the girl child. Men have abandoned their wives in order to participate in the elections. Women naturally, having started early marriage and all of that, that leads to larger number of children, so they are not able to participate. I bring in a case study of a woman in Orissa. She and her husband were actively involved with local issues, but they could not participate because of a two-child norm applied by the state. And they wanted to contest, and she had to say this, that you are saying that, we will be celebrated for our girl child, but that doesn't really happen. I do have daughters, but that is not making a difference to the government. And of course, the rest of it you can see. Now here I bring in the theoretical perspectives. Now, why am I, making a case for what I call a syncretic feminist perspective with an intersectionality approach? Because it has to be, we have to move away from one voice, because we have to bring about change on the ground, and linkage with rights and entitlements, very, very important, whether it is Susan Okin or it is Carol Pateman, that linkage with rights and entitlements is very important. There is Martha Nussbaum, who actually talks against the rights discourse, but I would like to bring her in because I think capabilities approach, not just looking at rights, but developing the capacities, the capabilities of women, that is also a rights-based approach, according to me, and Nussbaum's ideas are important. I also bring in the voice of a feminist scholar in India who works on citizenship. And she says that you need to build voice, agency, and citizenship rights. And that's extremely important, that it cannot just be about rights and entitlements in a family situation or property. Not everybody has property to, devolve or to provide. So you need to build voice, you need to have agency. So whether it's in the education system, girls can get very educated, but if they are not able to bargain and negotiate for themselves in a classroom scenario or in the larger question, raise questions. So that's important. Then strategic essentialism, Spivak, Fraser, Steens, they have all said that let us come together. When it is necessary, we can be separated. And so many times they have moved away from it, but I'm drawing it. Then Naila Kabir, mainstream social protection within broader development efforts. And then another very important, very interesting idea called curb cut feminism by Brooke Ackerley. She wrote this in 2008. It's used a lot. It's like jugaad. You can disagree, but let's just move away from each other. Let's bring it all in. Whichever works, wherever, we have to link up those issues. And because this field is so complex, so many contradictions, so many contestations, what are the linkages to be made? And of course, intersectionality, and so beautifully Linda Lane has explained, so I don't need to really discuss it, but you know what that is, Kimberly Crenshaw and so many others talking about it. UNFPA has done this. There's a take a look at assets. So that's a liberal perspective. Take a look at autonomy, and we talked about voice, agency. Another, aging. Children cannot be the only source of support. So that's why this whole male preference is there. And also again saying that women are better caregivers, I think that's a problem. And that needs to be attacked again, the syncretic feminists talking to each other, even in this discourse. So that we must look at policy response to ensure social care is a must. The state, can we move away from it? This is John Drays and Goel who say that while we can look at various social protection schemes, we cannot go backwards on all of them. We need to move forward. And they need to have a more proactive role of the state, while understanding state may not always be a benevolent representative of public good, but it can also be a site for women's needs, for allocation of resources. And as Kabir says, let's build the capacity of the marginalized so that they are able to struggle for these rights. This is Alison Agger, this is a 2013, and she's worked on this. She says that just don't look at your national level state, move beyond that. And this is the transnational feminist arguments. Many others have talked about it, but Alison Agger says that they cannot be only blamed on the non-Western cultures, because if you take a look at the global capitalist market, gender selections or all of that is also coming from the Western market. So how do you look at these transnational gender disparities? You look at it at transactional, cycles of gender vulnerability. So we are vulnerable now when it comes to sex selective abortion. But now look at the amount of plastic surgery and beauty products that have almost attacked the idea of women's bodies here, and how much of that is being chosen. So there is a transactional cycle of gender vulnerability which the global market also attacks, and we cannot blame only non-Western cultures. There is Neera Yuval Davis and Nina Webner, which is what we are doing, that who talks of feminist transversal practice, that we need to have these extensive networks. What you are doing today, having Linda Lane with Professor Patel and us, looking at international NGOs, international conversations, conferences, so that we have networks, we have conversations to take the syncretic perspective with an intersectionality approach forward. Alison Atter says that you cannot have your own communities. You need to create an epistemic community, which has values which are emancipatory, so that we can remove these oppressive power relations. Anupama Roy also talks about this, that we need to have a shared language, and that should be committed to democracy and equality. And that's all that I need to say here. Thank you so much for a patient hearing.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We would now like to have our chairperson, Professor Vibhuti Patel, to provide her remarks.
Thank you, Professor Vijayalakshmi Nanda, for encapsulating this whole 40 years of extremely volatile debate we have had among the anthropologists, economists, legal luminaries, and also the social activists and the feminists. And I think that we have gone beyond demand and supply. I think that intellectual maturity we have gained, because it was in the 60s where renowned economists were talking only in terms of demographic aspect, that if the demand of supply of women reduces, their status will go, status will enhance. So that kind of a reductionist logic, we have gone beyond that. But what I wanted to highlight is that we need to also link up this issue with the new reproductive technology, whether it is assisted reproduction or contraceptive technology or barbaric population control policy or sex selective this thing. So that is one issue that we need to unpack, and I think we need a special course for that. The second issue is that about what do we call the conditional cash transfer? It is so elitist to say that it is just bribing parents so that they don't kill their daughters. It is very reductionist way, because looking at the dowry and the kind of dilemma, not only the working class, but even the middle class is facing with, as you said, the commercialization of marriages had happened such a... For all other things, we call it affirmative action. Why can't we see it in the context of affirmative action, where the survival of the girl child is at stake? And because even during the colonial times, my community patidars, they were killing their daughters, and it was the British authority and the social reformers. They came up with the Doodh Piti Fund, and all the poor Patels, they were given fund by the state to see to it that their daughters are not killed. Now, how can we just say that this kind of a support system, whether it's a cradle baby scheme, okay, which I think, yeah, I would like your opinion also, which Tamil Nadu, and those girls have survived, when due to the state support as well as the community support, no both. So I just would like your opinion about whether you would see a conditional cash transfer as a social protection scheme, or you would see it as a protection to the parents.
So, I mean, I don't know whether I can have a completely holistic answer to that, but I agree with you that while certain conditional cash transfers have worked and they have provided us an understanding of what are the support systems at that point. So I think that's what Reyes and Goel have talked about, that we need to go forward. But there was a necessity to see it with a feminist lens. I mean, providing a poor family 1 lakh at the end of, 12th class, and then that is definitely feeding into dowry without working on dowry, without looking at the linkages towards employment or employability, or engaging with the idea of intersectionality here. What kind of a family, what are the kinds of needs? That kind of a notion was very, very necessary. So when it came to the Ladli scheme, which I actually studied in greater detail, I found that it was basically being seen as a supportive mechanism to the families. It was seen as a supportive mechanism to the families. But ultimately, was it seen as a support to the girl to develop herself, to find a way of out of the whole, the idea of marriage as it exists? Was it empowering enough? I didn't find that. And thereby, I personally feel the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao has a certain, it is certainly far more progressive because it is talking about a scholarship. And the idea of engaging with it from a point of view of a scholarship is better. Of course, there could be greater learnings for us from there. How do you move forward? Where does it work? Again, sex-selective abortion is not necessarily limited to poor families. So by saying that the conditional cash transfers are going to change the scenario is wrong, because those families which are going in for sex-selective abortion are actually the upper caste, upper class. Right now it has moved forward. People have had aspirations to move forward with that. So that is also there. So in that sense, I would say certain conditional cash transfers, yes, but the linkages forward have to be made, and a feminist perspective lens has to be used, and an intersectionality lens has to be used. On the cradle baby scheme, I mean, the idea is, of course, a welfareist idea. So it works there. So you're talking about adoption, you're talking about, okay, it's better to perhaps have a life protected. But at the end of the day, it is also about rejection and abandonment of the girl child. And it is still reinforcing the same stereotypes that daughters are liabilities. So we need to basically engage with the feminist perspective here. That's the feminist perspective, that why are women's rights are not recognized, or women not recognized as equal citizens, and where do we really need to work on this? So, when it comes to a cradle baby scheme, you're looking at two kinds of children who are given up. One is, of course, you're looking at poor families not able to take care, and therefore maybe that could be one. The other is children who are born so-called out of wedlock, and therefore those there. And so you are basically looking at two sides of this. Or you're looking at son preference, and that could be another, or daughter aversion, so you want to give up. So those are the three root causes that needs to be worked at. And I agree with you, we need to engage with the new reproductive technologies. We need to engage with commercial surrogacy, for example. Even when it comes to commercial surrogacy, I believe some of the statistics are showing us that that commercial surrogacy is used largely to have sons. So what are we looking at here? So if that is the case, and I believe in Maharashtra, there have been court cases where many activists have fought about this, looking at celebrity figures, all of them have actually had sons. So what is it that we are engaging with here? We are engaging with how the nexus between global capitalist order, scientific developments, and patriarchy. A global patriarchy, a kind of a multiple patriarchies at work, and we need to question all of that, and that's the syncretic feminist perspective. It cannot be one or the other. So that would be my humble submission here, if I can.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, we would like to move on to a few questions.
Yeah.
I've added them. Taranji, if you want to ask a question, please unmute and ask. or I can just read the question.
Yes, I can see that question. Yes. Do you believe that ecofeminist has essentialized? You know, ecofeminism is an essentialist feminist position. And I, for one, don't believe that women are necessarily protectors of the environment. They could also be polluters. Women are generally, they cannot be given that crown and then be put on a cross for that. So we have to be very careful to have that position. But having said that, I think ecofeminism in some ways captured a certain kind of an understanding around the ecological movements in India, at least in India or in the rest of the world, where women actually participated in large numbers, and they brought about, and because women were, they were engaged with those movements. So in that sense, it is a useful perspective. But to say that all women are essentially supportive of environmental, concerns would be problematic. And for that, I would say one should read Veena Agarwal. She's done an excellent job on critiquing the ecofeminist arguments. And I mean, I'm sure you can read that, but I would agree that it's important to engage with the ecofeminist argument while being very clear about where are the problems and the limitations with that. Yes, it is essentialist. I mean, in my syncretic feminist perspective, I do not use the ecofeminist argument, because I would then again be completely moving away from my own argument, which is that we are looking at equality rights, we are looking at intersectionality, and we cannot be, talking about, again, we would say that women are better mothers, women are better caregivers, I think that's something I wouldn't purport to, and it's necessary that we move away from essentialist understandings while recognizing the kind of struggles that women have had and how they have participated in numbers, in huge numbers. They have led eco movements. But we can say women are great. Women, by the numbers, are very good environmentalists. However, it's not necessary that all women are attuned to the idea of protecting the environment.
Ma'am, there's one more question if you want to take this.
Go on.
Ma'am, it's it's by Alia Ji, who's asking, how has there been legislation enacted to curtail / prohibit dowry? How has feminists in India campaigned for such legislation?
In the 1970s, and when we were very, very young, and the major struggle was against dowry. And in Delhi, the feminist movement in India was about dowry. It was about what they called the bride burning and the rest of it that happened out of dowry. Now you don't hear it. It is as if dowry doesn't exist. However, dowry continues. It is an entrenched practice, and it continues. And irrespective of the law that is there, there is a certain understanding that certain parts of the law are misused, and there has been a toning down of discussions around dowry or dowry murders. And it is important to do that, because the terminology that is used is dowry death, as if one naturally just dies of dowry. But here you're looking at murder. This is murder that is happening due to the fact that a young woman who's married into a family is not able to provide a certain amount of resource, which is actually illegal on both sides. So this again has to do with how daughters are seen as liabilities, and it ties up with why there is sex selective abortion. So I think the necessity is there. There is a law, but the implementation of the law, large work on the ground on it, discussions around it. And yes, what links up to dowry is the right for women's property. So while Indian laws, the 2005, we did bring about the co-partner rights in Hindu Succession Act, all rights for women for inheritance, but women are still writing off their property to their brothers. So that is a necessity, that the moment women have the right to property, perhaps their assertion of this right will make women say no to dowry. And that linkage is important. That particular linkage is important, because even women feel that, even young girls who are getting married feel that's their only time to assert some kind of resources for themselves. So making that linkage is important. And here again, self-reliance is important, but the movements are missing. I mean, there was a time in the 1980s, or one would actually have vehicles moving around with loudspeakers blaring, saying that taking dowry or giving dowry is a crime. You don't have those discussions. And it's important that the women's movement becomes linked to it again. And dowry murders are still a reality. It hasn't gone away. We've just invisibilized it. And we are not looking at the huge spending on marriages that takes place at all levels, and how much debt that, I think it's the second kind of high debts that are there, one on health and the other is on dowry. And we are not recognizing that, and we need to do that. We need to work closely on that.
As per National Crime Record Bureau, every day 3 women die due to dowry murders.
Yes,
Suicide
murder. Yes, right. And any other?
There are
I can't hear you, Ashwash.
Varsha Priya Datta. Alia Khan from Pakistan.
I think I answered dowry question, the
Yes.
Dowry Prohibition Act. And yes, feminists in India have struggled, and the struggle has been huge. It's been very huge. I think there's a Radha Kumar's book, History of Doing. I would recommend that to you, Alia, to look at the various struggles that are there. And we can recommend far more books. There is Varsha Priya Datta's How the Sense of Consciousness has been raised over a period of time. Could you please put on the has been raising, etc. on the basis has been raised. In terms of consciousness, I am ready to believe that I suffer from the disease of hope. I think there is a certain level of consciousness. We are sitting here talking, looking, examining. In terms of consciousness, the most important struggles, I think, has been the state to some extent recognizing the importance of women's rights because of the constant debate and dilemmas and all the discussions that the women's movement has had. The other is, I must say, when it comes to sexual harassment, if you take a look at gender discrimination at the workplace, I must say the consciousness there has emerged. And here the law has played a major role. So no matter how badly it is implemented, it is there. And no matter whatever the views on the Me Too movement, I think it shows us that there is a certain consciousness. And that consciousness has percolated down. And you do see it even in small towns. There is also consciousness around queer consciousness, which has emerged, sexuality, which has emerged. And you do see these discussions. So for us to assume that only the middle class or the upper class educated know about it, I wouldn't say so. We do see in small towns young women asserting their rights against child marriage, against dowry, for their empowered and informed choices. So I would say that and also it's part of your study. No one can escape it now, even if you still do see many kind of terrible obstacles in its path. But I think I am tilting towards hope, and for all the struggles that our feminist foremothers and sisters have fought, I think that it exists. And I feel even as a woman myself and leading an institution, I get all my strength from my feminist sisters. So I think that's where I think friendships, women's friendships, and men who are feminists and make friendships with women. But yes, being very alert to our privilege is also important. That making those friendships are also important with the working class, with cross conversations, learning from them. Very important. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would like to move on with this session, and I would like to invite again Chairperson VIBHUTI Patel, ma'am, to provide her concluding remarks for today's session. Ma'am, you need to unmute. You are still muted, ma'am.
Yeah, I think we had all 3 extremely brilliant presentations. All of them were erudite, very powerful in their arguments, and also the case studies that they provided and the grounded reality that they delineated. That is very important. I think all this, and now coming to the 3 days of deliberations, I can say that at the end of these 8 lectures, the question emerges that what is feminist future? Because that is also the title overarching concern of this winter school. And feminist future is committed to intergenerational, intersectional, syncretic, and dialogical approach, respect for plural perspectives that will move us towards a more just future. And what emerged from all these deliberations, even in the Q&A, I think all of us are committed to these ethos. Feminism is an all-encompassing worldview of a revolutionary change that transcends heteronormativity and embraces gender fluidity and gender inclusivity. Through collective efforts, feminism builds a movement to put an end to sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression, as Bell Hooks told us, to achieve full gender equality in law and in practice. Feminism is about all genders having equal rights and opportunities, and it is also committed to respecting diverse experiences, identities, streams of knowledge, and collective wisdom, and striving to empower all human beings to realize their full rights. Because in India, like we have a song which right from 1980, we have been singing that without women's liberation, there can't be liberation of human kind, and vice versa. Feminist movements in the coming future will expand horizons of our economic opportunity, political power, social justice, representation, and voice in the public spaces of governance, politics, legal and diplomatic spheres. Professor Vijaya Lakshmi Nanda, she beautifully framed this sentence that I suffer from a disease of hope. And I think that's true for, I think, all of us. We have a revolutionary optimism, as Karl Marx had also told about, that all of us are born optimists and we are fighting against some extremely powerful forces. But if we are together, we can use our collective wisdom to bend this power structure. Feminist movements will stand in solidarity with the vulnerable among us and also holding those who make us unsafe accountable, as well as imagining and creating a democracy and economy that works for all of us. It depends on all of us to strive with the commitment to feminist ethos and further feminist legacies of our foremothers, as it was beautifully worded by, I think, all the speakers and all the sessions. They refer to feminist foremothers over the last 200 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think you wonderfully summarized everything that we have talked about in this session. And with this, we come to the end of this online international winter school program 2023, a 3-day immersive online certificate training course on feminism fundamentals, facets, and future. I, with this, would like to formally propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI and Impact Studies Center, GISC, New Delhi. We are grateful to our experts of this online certificate training program for joining us and providing their precious inputs, which includes panelists Dr. Leena Pujari, Professor Roxana Marinescu, Professor Manisha Desai, Dr. Wahida Nenar, Professor Vibhuti Patel, Professor Soumya Uma, Professor Linda Lane, and Professor Vijaya Lakshmi Nanda. And to Professor Vibhuti Patel for chairing the entire session. We thank all of our participants for asking important questions and thereby adding to these conversations and actively participating in today's deliberations. I would like to inform all the participants that as an institution's policy, we do not share the experts' PowerPoints and presentations. However, those who need a copy of it can write and get in touch with the experts and request the same, citing reference to this course. We will share the feedback form via email. We request you all to kindly fill it, following which we will be sharing the certificate of completion in a couple of days. We have shared the recorded video of the training program in your email for your kind perusal in case you have missed the live sessions. Now, I would like to thank the organizing team, IMPRI, the Gender Studies and Impact Center, New Delhi, for conducting the entire session in such a smooth manner. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube, listening to us on our various podcasts, or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join us in the future to our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. With this, we wish you a very good evening. Thank you so much.